The Changing World Order, Chapter 2, The Big Cycle of Money, Credit, Debt, and Economic Activity by Dalio. To make this an easier and shorter article to read, I tried to convey the most important points in simple language and bolded them so you can get the gist of the whole thing in just a few minutes by focusing on what's in bold. Past chapters from the series can be found here, Introduction and Chapter 1. Additionally, if you want a simple and entertaining 30-minute explanation of how a lot of what I'm talking about here works, see How the Economic Machine Works, which is available on YouTube. This article, along with others in this series, are an early preview of a book I'm working on called The Changing World Order. I will publish the book this fall, but felt that as I was writing it, the learning I was getting from my research was very helpful in understanding what is happening right now, so I wanted to pass it along to you as a work in progress. If you'd like to sign up to receive updates on this series, go to principles.com. You can also pre-order the book at Amazon or Barnes & Nobles. Because what most people in their countries want the most is wealth and power, and because money and credit are the biggest single influence on how wealth and power rise and decline, if you don't understand how money and credit work, you can't understand the biggest driver of politics within and between countries, so you can't understand how the world order works. And if you don't understand how the world order works, you can't understand what's coming at you. For example, if you don't understand how the Roaring '20s led to a debt bubble and a big wealth gap, and how the bursting of that debt bubble led to the 1930 to 33 depression, and how the depression wealth gap led to conflicts over wealth all around the world, you can't understand the forces that led Franklin D. Roosevelt being elected president. You also wouldn't understand why, soon after his inauguration in 1933, he announced a new plan in which the central government and the Federal Reserve would together provide a lot of money and credit, a change that was similar to things happening in other countries at the same time and similar to what is happening right now. Without understanding money and credit, you wouldn't understand why these things changed the world order, nor would you understand what happened next, i.e. the war, how it was won and lost, and why the new world order was created as it was in 1945. And you wouldn't be able to understand what is happening now or imagine the future. However, by seeing many of these cases and understanding the mechanics behind them, you will be better to understand what is happening right now and what is likely to happen in the future. In doing this study, I spoke with several of the world's most renowned historians and political practitioners, including current and former heads of state, foreign ministers, finance ministers, and central bankers. In our explorations of how the world really works, it was clear that we brought different pieces of the puzzle that made the picture much clearer when we put them together. We agreed that the two most essential understandings to have are of 1, how money, credit, and economics work, and 2, how domestic and international politics work. Several told me that the understanding conveyed in this chapter has been the biggest missing piece in their quest to understand the lessons of history, and I explained to them how their perspectives help me better understand the political dynamic that affects economic policy choices. This chapter is focused on the money, credit, and economic piece. Let's start with the timeless and universal fundamentals of money and credit. All entities, people, companies, nonprofit organizations, and governments deal with the same basic financial realities and always have. They have money that comes in and money that goes out, which netted makes up their net income. These flows are measured in numbers that can be shown in their income statements. If one brings in more than one spends, one has a profit that causes one's savings to go up. If one's spending is more than one's earnings, one's savings go down or has to make up the difference by borrowing it or taking it from someone else. The assets and liabilities that one has can be shown in one's balance sheet. Whether one writes these numbers out or not, every country, company, nonprofit organization, and the person has them. The relationships between each entity's income expenses, and savings, when combined to be the relationships between all these entities, incomes, expenses, and savings, transpire in a dynamic way to be the biggest driver of changes in the world order. So, if you can take your understanding of your own income, expenses, and savings, imagine how that applies to others, and put them together, you'll see how the whole thing works. In brief, if one spends more than one takes in, one has to get the money from somewhere. And if one takes in more than one spends, one has to put the money one gains somewhere. If one is short of money, one can get the money by either drawing down one's savings, borrowing the money, or taking it from someone else. If one has more money than one uses, it will either be added to one's savings as an investment or given to someone else. What one's savings looks like, i.e. the assets and the liabilities, shows up in one's balance sheet. If one has more assets than liabilities, one can spend above one's income by selling assets until the money runs out, at which point he has to slash one's expenses. If one doesn't have much more in assets than one has in liabilities, and one's income falls beneath the amount one needs to pay out to cover the total of one's operating expenses and one's debt to service expenses, one will have to cut one's expenses or will default/restructure one's debts. Since one person's spending is another person's income, that cutting of expenses will hurt not just that entity that is having to cut those expenses, but it will hurt the ones who depend on that spending to earn income. Similarly, since one's debts are another assets that are defaulting on debts reduces other entities' assets, which requires them to cut their spending. This dynamic produces a self-reinforcing downward debt and economic contraction that becomes a political issue as people argue over how to divide the shrunken pie. As a principle, debt eats equity. What I mean by that is for most systems, when the rules of the game are followed, debts have to be paid above all else so that when one has equity ownership, e.g., in one's investment portfolio or in one's house, and one can't service a debt, the asset will be sold or taken away. In other words, a creditor will get paid ahead of the owner of the asset. As a result, when one's income is less than one's expenses and one's assets are less than one's liabilities, one is on the way to having one's assets sold and going broke. However, unlike what most people intuitively think, there isn't a fixed amount of money and credit in existence. Money and credit can be easily be created by governments. Their creating it is liked because it gives people, companies, nonprofit organizations, and governments more spending power. They're taking the credit and spending it on goods, services, and investment assets makes most everything go up in price, which most people like. The problem is that it creates a lot of debt, and paying it back is difficult and painful. That is why money, credit, debt, and economic activity are inherently cyclical. In the credit creation phase, demand for goods, services, and investment assets and the production of them is strong, and in the debt paying them back phase, it is weak. But what if the debts never had to be paid back? Then there would be no debt squeeze and no painful paying back period. But that would be terrible for those that lent them to them because they lose their money, right? Let's think about that for a moment to see if we can find a way around that problem. Since government, i.e. the central government and the central bank combined, has the abilities to both make and borrow money, why couldn't the central bank lend money at an interest rate of about 0% to the central government to distribute it as likes, and also lend to others at low rates and allow those debtors to never pay it back? Normally, debtors have to pay the original amount borrowed, principal, plus interest in installments over a period of time. But what if the interest rate was 0? And the central bank that lent that money kept rolling over debt so that the debtor never had to pay it back? That would be the equivalent of giving the debtors money, but it wouldn't look that way because the debt would still be accounted for as an asset that central banks own, so that the central bank can still say it's performing its normal lending function. Central banks could do that. In fact, that is what is now happening. To understand what is now happening and will happen financially to you, to other individuals, to companies, to nonprofit organizations, to governments, and to whole economies, it is important to watch how their income statements and balance sheets are doing and to imagine what will likely happen. Take a moment to think about this as happening to you and your own financial situation. How much income do you have and will you have in the future relative to your expenses? How much savings do you have and what's that in savings? What's that savings in? Now play things out. If your income fell or disappeared, how long would your savings last? How much risk do you have in the value of investments in your savings? If your savings fell in value by half, how would you be financially? Can you easily sell your assets to get cash to pay back your expenses or service your debts? What are your other sources of money from the government or from elsewhere? These are the most important calculations you can make to assure your economic well-being. Now look at others, other people, businesses, nonprofit organizations, and governments, realizing that the same is the true for them. Now see how we are interconnected and what changes and conditions might mean for you and others who might affect you. Since the economy is nothing more than all these entities operating in this way, if you can visualize this well, it will help you understand what's happening and what is likely to happen. As for what is happening now, the biggest problem that we collectively now have is that for many people, companies, nonprofit organizations, governments, the incomes are low in relation to the expenses, and the debts and other liabilities are very large relative to the value of their assets. It may not seem that way. In fact, it may seem the opposite, because there are many people, companies, nonprofit organizations, and governments that look rich even while they are in the process of going broke. They look rich because they spend a lot, have plenty of assets, and even have plenty of cash. However, if you look carefully, you will be able to identify those who look rich but are in financial trouble because they have incomes that are below their expenses and or liabilities that are greater than their assets. So if you project out what will likely happen to their finances, you will see that they will have to cut their expenses and sell their assets in painful ways that will leave them broke. We each need to do those projections of what the future will look like for our own finances and for others who are relevant to us and for the whole world economy. If anything I said is confusing you, I urge you to think about it until you get it. So pencil out what your financial safety margin looks like. Then do that calculation for others, add them up, and then you will have a good picture of the state of the world. I've done that with the help of my partners at Bridgewater and find it invaluable in the imagining what is likely to happen. You can read more of my perspective on this in the big picture. In a nutshell, the liabilities are enormous relative to the net incomes and the asset values that are required to meet those obligations. In summary, those basic financial realities work for all people, companies, nonprofit organizations, and governments in the same way they work for you and me, with one big exception. All countries can create money and credit out of thin air to give people to spend or to lend it out. By producing money and giving it to debtors in need, central banks can prevent the debt crisis dynamic that I just explained. For that reason, I will modify the prior principle to say that debt eats equity, money feeds the hunger of debt, and central banks can produce money. So it should not be surprising that governments print money when there are debt crises that are causing debt to eat more equity and causing more economic pain that is politically acceptable. However, not all money that government prints is of equal value. The monies, currencies, that are widely accepted around the world are called reserve currencies. At this time, the world's dominant reserve currency is the US dollar, which is created by the US Central Bank, which is the Federal Reserve. It accounts for about 55% of all international transactions. A much less important currency is the euro, which is produced by the Eurozone country's central bank, the European Central Bank. It accounts for about 25% of all international transactions. The Japanese yen, the Chinese ruble, and the British pound are all effectively small reserve currency now, although the ruble is growing quickly in importance. Having a reserve currency is great while it lasts because it gives a country exceptional borrowing and spending power, but also sows the seed of it ceasing to be a reserve currency, which is a terrible loss. That is because having a reserve currency allows a country to borrow a lot more than it could otherwise borrow, which leads it to have too much debt that can't be paid back, which requires the central bank to create a lot of money and credit, which devalues the currency, so nobody wants to hold the reserve currency as a storehold of wealth. Countries that reserve currencies can produce a lot of money and credit/debit denominated in them, especially when there is a shortage of them as now. That is what the Fed is doing now. In contrast, countries that don't have a reserve currency are especially prone to finding themselves in need of those reserve currencies, e.g. dollars, when A, they have a lot of debt that is owed in the reserve currencies that they can't print, e.g. dollars. B, they don't have much savings in those reserve currencies. And C, their ability to earn currencies they need falls off. When countries that don't have reserve currencies desperately need reserve currencies to pay their debts that are denominated in reserve currencies and to buy things from sellers who want them to pay in reserve currencies, their inability to get enough reserve currencies to meet those needs can bankrupt them. That is where things stand now for a number of countries. It is also where things stand for local governments and states and for many of us. For example, in other states, local governments, companies, nonprofit organizations, and people have suffered income losses and don't have much savings relative to their losses. They will have to cut their expenses or get money and credit from some other way. Others will get money or very cheap credit that they may never have to be paid back from the government. That may never have to be paid back from the government. The government, and not the free market, will determine who gets what. So I guess it's like a bailout, I guess. At the time of this writing, the income levels of a number of people, companies, nonprofit organizations, and governments have plunged to be below their expense levels by amounts that are large in relation to their net worth, so they will be forced to either slash their expenses, which is painful to do now, or to risk running out of their savings and having to default on their debts. Governments that have the power to do so are creating money and credit to give many, but not all of them, to help ease the debt burdens and help finance the expenses that are denominated in their own currencies. This configuration of circumstances has happened throughout history and has been handled in the same way, so it's easy to see how this machine works. That is what I want to make sure that I convey in this chapter. Let's start with the real basics and build from there. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange that can also be used as a storehold of wealth. By medium of exchange, I mean that it can be given to someone to buy things. Basically, people produce things in order to exchange them with people who have other things that they want. Because carrying around money, objects, in the hope of exchanging them for what they want is inefficient. Virtually every society that has ever existed has invented money to be something portable that everyone agrees is of value so it can be exchanged for what we want. By a storehold of wealth, I mean a vehicle restoring buying power between acquiring it and spending it. While people can store their wealth in assets that they expect will retain their value or appreciate, such as gold, gems, painting, real estate, stocks, and bonds, one of the most logical things to store it in has been the money that one will use later. But they actually don't hold the currency because they believe they can hold something a bit better and always exchange the thing that they're holding to get the currency to buy the things they want to buy. That is where credit and debt come into the picture. When lenders lend, they assume that the money they will receive back will buy more goods and services than if they just held onto the money. If done well, the borrowers use the money productively and earn a profit so that they can pay the lenders back and keep some extra money. When the loan is outstanding, it is an asset for the lender and a liability for the borrower. When the money is paid back, the assets and liabilities disappear and the exchange is good for both the borrowers and the lenders. They essentially split the profits that come from both doing this productive lending. It is also good for the whole society, which benefits from the productivity gains that result from this. So it's important to realize that 1, most money and credit, especially money, the fiat money that now exist has no intrinsic value. It is just journal entries in an accounting system that can easily be changed. The purpose of the system is to help allocate resources efficiently so that productivity can grow, rewarding both lenders and borrowers, and that the system periodically breaks down. As a result, since the beginning of time, all currencies have either been destroyed or devalued. When currencies are destroyed or devalued, that shifts wealth in a big way that sends reverberations through the economy and markets. More specifically, rather than working perfectly, the money and credit system swings the supplies, demands, and the values of the money in cycles that in the upswings produce joyful abundance and in the downswings produce painful restructurings. Let's now get into how these cycles work, building from the fundamentals up to where we are now. The fundamentals. While money and credit are associated with wealth, they aren't wealth. Because money and credit can buy wealth, i.e. goods and services, the amount of money and credit one has and the amount of wealth one has looks pretty much the same. But one cannot create more wealth simply by creating more money and credit. To build wealth, one has to be more productive. The relationship between the creation of money and credit and the creation of wealth, actual goods and services, is often confused, yet is the biggest driver of economic cycles. So let's look at this relationship more closely. Wow, wealth is just goods and services. Interesting. There's typically a mutual reinforcing relationship. A, the creation of money and credit. B, the amount of goods, services, and investment assets that are produced, so it's easy to get them confused. Think of it this way. There's both a real economy and a financial economy. They are related. They are different. Each has their own supply and demand factors that drive them. For example, in the real economy, when the level of goods and services demanded is strong and rising, the capacity to produce those things demanded is limited. The real economy's capacity to grow is limited, and if demand keeps rising faster than the capacity to produce, inflation rises. In that example, inflation rises because of what is happening in the real economy, knowing that central banks normally tighten money and credit at such times to slow the demand. That is an example of something that is happening in the financial economy affecting what is happening in the real economy. During normal times, which is through most of the long-term debt cycle, central banks turn on and off credit, which raises and lowers demand and production. Because they do that imperfectly, we have the short-term debt cycles, which we also call overheated economies and recessions. In the financial economy, normally money and credit are created by central banks and flow into financial assets, which produces lending that finances people's borrowings and spending, with the private credit system allocating that money and credit. How financial assets are produced by the government through fiscal and monetary policy has a huge effect on who gets the money and credit and the buying power that goes along with it, which also determines what it's spent on. For example, you see now governments atypically giving money, credit, and buying power to those they want to get it rather than it being allocated by the marketplace. So you are seeing capitalism as you know it being suspended. I don't know if he's talking about bailouts here or if he's just talking about that interest rates are low and, banks can buy those bonds or just companies can borrow money at basically 0% interest. I'm not sure. Then, of course, there's the value of money and credit to consider. It is based on its own supply and demand. For example, when a lot of it is created relative to the demand for it, it declines in value. Where it flows to is important to determine what happens. For example, when the money and credit that central banks are creating no longer go into lending, that fuels increases in economic demand and instead goes into other currencies and inflation hedge assets. It fails to stimulate economic activity and instead causes the value of currency to decline and the value of inflation hedge assets to rise. At such time, high inflation can occur because the supply of money and credit has been increased relative to the demand for it, which we call monetary inflation. This can happen at the same time as there is weak demand for goods and services in the selling of assets, so the real economy is experiencing deflation. This is how inflationary depressions come about. For these reasons, to understand what is likely to happen financially and economically, one has to watch movements in the supply demands of both the real economy and the financial economy. Similarly confused is the relationship between the prices of things and the value of things. Because they tend to go together, they can be confused as being the same thing. They tend to go together because when people have more money and credit, they are more inclined to spend more and can spend more. In other words, if you give people more money and credit, they will feel richer and spend more on goods and services. To the extent that spending increases economic production and raises the prices of goods, services, and financial assets, and it can be said to increase wealth, because the people who own those assets become richer when measured by the way we account for wealth. However, that increase in wealth is more an illusion than reality for two reasons. One, the increased credit that pushes prices and production up has to be paid back, which, all things being equal, will have the opposite effect when it has to be paid back. Two, the intrinsic value of things doesn't increase just because their prices go up. Think about it this way. If you own a house and the government creates a lot of money and credit, and the price of your house goes up, you will still own the same house. Your actual wealth hasn't increased, just your calculated wealth has increased. Similarly, if the government creates a lot of money and credit that is used to buy goods, services, and investment assets, e.g. stocks, bonds, and real estate, which go up in price, the amount calculated of wealth goes up, but the amount of actual wealth hasn't gone up because you own the exact same thing you did before. It was considered worth more. In other words, using market values of what owns to measure one's wealth gives an illusion of changes in wealth that doesn't really exist. As far as how the economic machine works, the big thing is that money and credit is stimulative when it is giving out and depressing when it has to be paid back. That's what normally makes money, credit, and economic growth so cyclical. The people who control money and credit, i.e. central banks, vary the cost and availability of money and credit to control markets and the economy as a whole. When the economy is growing too quickly and they want to slow it down, they make less money and credit available, causing both to become more expensive. This encourages people to lend rather than to borrow and spend. When there is too little growth and central bankers want to stimulate the economy, they make money and credit cheap and plentiful, which encourages people to borrow and invest or spend. These variations in the cost and availability of money and credit causes the prices of quantities of goods, services, and investment assets to rise and fall. But banks can only control the economy within their capacities to produce money and credit growth, and their capacities to do that are limited. Think of the central bank as having a bottle of stimulant that they can inject into the economy as needed, with the amount of stimulant in the bottle being limited. When the markets and the economy sag, they give them shots of the money and credit stimulant to pick them up, and when they're too hot, they give them less stimulant. These moves lead to cyclical rises and declines in the amounts and prices of money and credit and of goods and services and financial assets. These moves typically come in the form of short-term debt cycles and long-term debt cycles. The short-term cycles of ups and downs typically last about 8 years, give or take a few. The timing is determined by the amount of time it takes a stimulant to raise demand to the point that it reaches the limits of the real economy's capacity to produce. Most people have seen enough of these short-term debt cycles to know what they are like. So much so that they mistakenly think that they will go on working this way forever. They are most popularly called the business cycle, though I call them the short-term debt cycle to distinguish them them from the long-term debt cycle. Over long periods of time, these short-term debt cycles add up to long-term debt cycles that typically last about 50 to 75 years. Because they come along about once in a lifetime, most people aren't aware of them. As a result, they typically take people by surprise, which hurts a lot of people. The last big long-term debt cycle, which is the one that we are in now, was designed in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and it was put in place in 1945 when the World War II ended and we began the U.S. dollar-denominated world order. These long-term debt cycles start when debts are low after previously existing debts have been restructured in a way so that central banks have a lot of stimulant in the bottle, and they end when debts are high and central banks don't have much stimulant left in the bottle. More specifically, the ability of central banks to be stimulative ends when the central bank loses its ability to produce money and credit growth that pass through the economic system to produce real economic growth. That loss ability of central bankers typically takes place when debt levels are high, interest rates can't be adequately lowered, and the creation of money and credit increases financial asset prices more than it increases actual economic activity. Oh no. At such times, those who are holding the debt, which is someone else's promise to give them currency, typically want to exchange the currency debt they are holding for other storeholds of wealth. When it is widely perceived that the money and the debt assets that are promises to receive money are not good storeholds of wealth, the long-term debt cycle is at its end and a restructuring of the monetary system has to occur. Let me read that again. At such times, those who are holding the debt, which is a central bank, typically want to exchange the currency debt they are holding for other storeholds of wealth. When it is widely perceived that the money and the debt assets that are the promises to receive money are not good storeholds of wealth, the long-term debt cycle is at its end, and a restructuring has to occur. Okay. In other words, the long-term debt cycle runs from 1, low debt and debt burdens, which give those who control money and credit growth plenty of capacity to create debt, and with it, buying power for borrowers and a high likelihood that the lender who is holding debt assets will get repaid with good real returns, which I guess is more like the start of what happened in 1945. The 2, high debt and debt burdens with little capacity to create buying power for borrowers and a low likelihood that the lender will be repaid with good returns. At the end of the long-term debt cycle, there is essentially no more stimulant in the bottle, i.e. no more ability of central bankers to extend the debt cycle, so there needs to be a debt restructuring or a debt devaluation to reduce the debt burdens and start the cycle over again, which is where we are now. Throughout history, central bank governments and central banks have created money and credit which weaken their own currencies and raise their levels of monetary inflation to offset the deflation that comes from the deflationary credit system and contractions. Since these cycles are big deals and have happened virtually everywhere for as long as there's been recorded history, we need to understand them and have timeless and universal principles for dealing with them as well. However, these long-term debt cycles take about a lifetime to transpire, unlike the short-term debt cycles that we all experience a number of times in our lifetimes, so most people understand better. When it comes to the long-term debt cycle, most people, including most economists, don't recognize or acknowledge its existence, because to see a number of them in order to understand the mechanisms of how they work, one has to look at them operating in a number of countries over many hundreds of years in order to get a good sample size. In part 2 of this study, we will look at all of the most important cycles with reference to the timeless and universal mechanics of why money and credit have worked and failed to work as mediums of exchange and storeholds of wealth. In this chapter, we will look at how they typically work. I will start with the basics of the long-term debt cycle from way back when and bring you up to present, giving you the classic template. To repeat, I'm saying that this is a classic template, and I'm not saying that all cases transpire exactly like this, though I'm saying that almost all follow this pattern closely. The long-term debt cycle. It begins with no or low debt and hard money. When societies first invented money, they used all sorts of things like grain and beads, but mostly they used things that had intrinsic value, like gold, silver, and copper. Let's call that hard money. Gold and silver, and sometimes copper and other metals like nickel, were preferred forms of money because 1, they had intrinsic value. 2, they could be easily shaped in size to be portable so they could be easily exchanged. Having intrinsic value, i.e. being useful in and of themselves, was important because no trust or credit was required to carry out an exchange with them. Any transaction could be settled on the spot, even if the buyer and seller were strangers or enemies. There's an old saying that gold is the only financial asset that isn't someone else's liability. That's because it has widely accepted intrinsic value, unlike debt assets or other assets that require an enforceable contract or law to ensure the other side will deliver on its promise to deliver whatever it promised to deliver. On the other hand, if during such a period of lack in trust and enforceability one receives gold coins from a buyer, that doesn't have a credit component to it, i.e. you could melt them down and still receive almost the same amount of value because of its intrinsic value. So the transaction can happen without the same sort of risks and lingering promises that need to be kept. When countries were at war and there was not trust in the intentions or abilities to pay, they could still pay in gold. So gold, and to a lesser extent silver, could be used as a safe medium of exchange and safe storehold of wealth. Then come claims on hard money, aka notes or paper money. Because carrying a lot of metal money around was risky and inconvenient, credible parties, which came to be known as banks, though they initially included all sorts of institutions that people trusted, such as temples in China, arose that would put money in a safe place and issue paper claims on it. Soon, people treated these paper claims on money as if they were money themselves. After all, they were as good as money because they could be redeemed for tangible money. This type of currency system is called a linked currency system because the value of the currency is linked to the value of something, typically a hard money such as gold. Then comes increased debt. At first, there is the same number of claims on the hard money as there is in hard money in the bank. However, the holders of the paper claims in the bank discovers the wonders of credit and debt. They can lend these paper claims to the bank in exchange for an interest payment, so they get an interest. The bank that borrows it from them like it because they lend the money to others who pay a higher interest rate, so the banks make more profit. And those who borrow the money from the bank like it because it gives them buying power that they didn't have. And the whole society likes it because it leads asset prices and production to rise. Since everyone is happy with how things are going, they do a lot of it. More lending and borrowing happens over and over many times again. There is a boom in the quantity of the claims on the money, i.e. debt assets, rises relative to the amount of actual goods and services there are to buy. Trouble approaches either when there isn't enough income to survive one's debts or when the amount of claims that the people are holding and the expectation that they can sell them to get money to buy goods and services increase faster than the amount of goods and services by an amount that makes the conversion from the debt asset, e.g. bond, implausible. These two problems tend to come together. Concerning the first of these problems, think of debt as negative earnings and negative assets that eat up earnings because earnings have to go to pay for it, and eats up other assets because other assets have to be sold to get the money to pay the debt. It is senior, meaning it gets paid before any other type of asset. So when incomes and the values of one's assets fall, there is a need to cut expenditures and sell off assets to raise the needed cash. When that's not enough, there needs to be a debt restructuring in which debts and debt burdens are reduced, which is problematic for both the debtor and the creditor because one's debts are another person's assets, or B, central bank printing money and the central government handing out money and credit to fill the holes in incomes and balance sheets, which is happening right now. Concerning the second of these problems, it occurs when holders of debt don't believe that they're going to get adequate returns for it. Debt assets are held by investors who believe that they are storeholds of wealth that can be sold to get money, which can be used to buy things. When the holders of debt assets try to make the conversion to real money and real goods and services and find out that they can't, this problem surfaces. Then a run occurs, by which I mean a lot of holders of that debt want to make that conversion to money, goods, services, and other financial assets. The bank, regardless of whether it's a private bank or central bank, is then faced with a choice to allow that flow of money out of the debt asset, which will raise interest rates and cause the debt and economic problems to worsen, or to print money and to buy enough of those bonds that others are selling to prevent interest rates from rising and hopefully reverse the run out of them. Sometimes you're doing that, buying works temporarily, but if the ratio of A, claims on money, to B, the amount of money there is and the quantity of goods and services there are to buy is too high, the bank is in a bind because it can't get out of it because it simply doesn't have enough money to meet the claims, so it will have to default on its claims. When that happens to a central bank, it has a choice to either default or to print the money and devalue it. They inevitably devalue. When these debt restructurings and currency devaluations are big, they lead to breakdowns and possibly destruction of the monetary system. Whatever the bank or central bank does, the more debt, i.e. claims on money and claims on goods and services, there is more likelihood that it will be necessary to devalue the money. Remember, Remember that there is always a limited amount of goods and services because the amount is constrained by the ability to produce. Also remember that in our example of paper money being claims on the hard money, there is a limited amount of that hard money, e.g. the gold on deposit, while the amount of paper money, e.g. the claims on that hard money, and debt is constantly growing. And as that amount of paper money claims grows relative to the amount of hard money in the bank and goods and services in the economy, the risk increases that the holders of these debt assets may not be able to redeem them for the amounts of hard money or goods and services that they'd expect to be able to exchange them for. It is important to understand the difference between money and debt. Money is what settles claims, i.e. one pays one's bills and one is done. Debt is a promise to deliver money. In watching how the machine is working, it is important to watch A, the amounts of both debt and money that exist relative to the amount of hard money, e.g. gold in the bank, and B, the amounts of goods and services that exist, which can vary, remembering that debt cycles happen because most people love to expand their buying power, generally through debt, while central banks tend to want to expand the amount of money in existence because people are happier when they do that. But this can't go on forever. And it's important to remember that the leveraging up phase of the money and debt cycle ends when bankers, whether private bankers or central bankers, create a lot more certificates, paper money, and debt than there is hard money in the bank to give, and the inevitable day comes when more certificates are turned in than there is money to give. Let's look at how that happens. Then come debt crises, defaults, and devaluations. History has shown that when the bank's claims on money grow faster than the amount of money in the bank, whether the bank is private or government controlled, i.e. central bank, eventually the demands for money will become greater than the money the bank can provide and the bank will default on its obligations. That is what is called a bank run. One can quite literally tell when a bank run is happening and a banking crisis is imminent by watching the amounts of money in banks, whether hard or paper, decline and approach the point of running out due to withdrawals. A bank that can't deliver enough hard money to meet the claims that are being made on it is in trouble, whether it is a private or a central bank, though central banks have more options than private banks do. That's because a private bank simply can't print the money or change the laws to make it easier to pay their debts, while a central bank can. Private bankers must either default or get bailed out by the government when they get into trouble, while central bankers can devalue their claims, e.g. pay back 50 to 70% if their debts are denominated in their national currency. If the debt is denominated in a currency that they can't print, then they too must ultimately default. Then comes fiat money. Central banks want to stretch the money and credit cycle to make it last as long as they can, because that is so much better than the alternative. So when hard money and claims on hard money become too painfully constrictive, governments typically abandon them in favor of what is called fiat money. No hard money is involved in fiat systems. There is just paper money that the central bank can print without restriction. As a result, there is no risk that the central bank will have its stash of hard money drawn down and have to default on its promises to deliver it. Rather, the risk is that, freed from the constraints on the supply of tangible gold or some other hard asset, the people who control the printing presses, i.e. the central bankers working with the commercial bankers, will create ever more money and debt assets and liabilities in relation to the amount of goods and services being produced until the time when those who are holding the enormous amount of debt will try to turn them in for goods and services, which will have the same effect as a run on a bank and result in either debt defaults or the devaluation of money. That shift from A system in which debt notes are convertible to a tangible asset, e.g. gold at a fixed rate, to B, a fiat monetary system in which there is no such convertibility, last happened in 1971. When that happened on the evening of August 15th, when President Nixon spoke to the nation and told the world that the dollar would no longer be tied to gold, I watched that on TV and thought, oh my God, the monetary system as we know it is ending. And it was. I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange at the time, and that Monday morning I went on the floor expecting pandemonium with stocks falling and found pandemonium with stocks rising. Because I had never seen a devaluation before, I didn't understand how they worked. Then I looked into history and found that on Sunday evening, March 5th, 1993, President Franklin Roosevelt gave essentially the same speech, doing essentially the same thing, which yielded essentially the same result over the following months: a devaluation, a big stock market rally, and big gains in the gold price. And I saw that happen many times before in many countries, including essentially the same proclamation by the heads of state. In the years leading up to 1971, the U.S. government spent a lot of money on military and social programs, then referred to as guns and butter policy, which paid for it by borrowing money that created debt. The debt was a claim on money that could be turned in for gold. The investors brought this debt as assets because they got paid interest on this government debt, and because the U.S. government promised that it would allow the holders of these notes to exchange them for the gold that was held in the gold vaults in the U.S. As the spending and budget deficits in the U.S. grew, the U.S. had to issue much more debt, i.e. create many more claims on gold, even though the amount of gold in the bank didn't go up. Naturally, more investors turned in their promises to get the gold for the claims on the gold. People who were astute enough to pay attention could see that the U.S. was running out of gold, and the amount of outstanding claims on gold was much larger than the amount of gold in the bank. So they realized that if this continued, the U.S. would default. Of course, the idea that the U.S. government, the richest and most powerful government in the world, would default on its promise to give those who had claims on the gold it promised to give them, seemed implausible at the time. So while most people were surprised at the announcement and the effects on the markets, those who understood the mechanics of how money and credit work were not. When credit cycles reach their limit, it is both the logical and classical response for central bank governments to create a lot of debt and print money that will be spent on goods, services, and investment assets to keep the economy moving. That is what was done during the 2008 debt crisis, when interest rates could no longer be lowered because they had already hit zero. As explained, that was also done in response due to the 1929-32 debt crisis, when interest rates had been driven to zero. This creating of the debt and money is now happening in amounts that are greater than at any time since World War II. To be clear, central banks printing money and giving it out for this spending rather than supporting spending with debt growth is not without its benefits, e.g., money spends like credit, but in practice, rather than theory, it doesn't have to be paid back. In other words, there's nothing wrong with having an increase in money growth instead of an increase in credit/debt growth, provided that the money is put to a productive use. The main risk of printing money rather than facilitating credit growth are A, market participants will fail to carefully analyze whether the money is being put to productive use, and B, it eliminates the need to have the money be paid back. Both increase the chances that money will be printed too aggressively and not used productively, so people will stop using it as a storehold of wealth and will shift their wealth into other things. Throughout history, when the outstanding claims on hard money, debt, and money certificates are far greater than there is hard money and goods and services, a law of defaults or money printing and devaluing have always happened. History has shown us that we shouldn't rely on governments to protect us financially. On the contrary, we should expect most governments to abuse their privileged positions as the creators and users of money and credit for the same reasons that you might do these abuses if you were in their shoes. That is because no one policymaker owns the whole cycle. Each one comes in at one or another part of it and does what is in their interest to do at that time, given their circumstances at the time. Because early in the debt cycle, governments are considered trustworthy and they need and want money as much or more than anyone else. They are typically the biggest borrowers. Later in the cycle, when successive leaders come in to run the more indebted governments, the new government leaders and the new central bankers have to face the greater challenge of paying back debts when they have less stimulant in the bottle. To make matters worse, governments also have to bail out debtors whose failures would hurt the system. As a result, they tend to get themselves into big cash flow jams that are larger than those of individual companies or individuals and most other entities. In other words, in virtually all the cases, the government contributes to the accumulation of debt in its actions by becoming a large debtor, and when the debt bubble bursts, bails itself and others out by printing money and devaluing it. The larger debt crisis, the more that is true. The larger the debt crisis, the more that is true. While undesirable, it is understandable why it happens. When you can manufacture money and credit and pass it out to everyone to make them happy, it is very hard to resist the temptation to do so. It is a classic financial move. Throughout history, rulers have run up debts that won't come due until long after their reign is over, leaving it to their successors to pick up the pieces. How do governments react when they have debt problems? They do what any practical, heavily indebted entity with promises to give money that they can print would do. Without exception, they print money and devalue it if the debt is in their own currency. When central banks print money and buy up debt, that puts more money in the financial system and bids up the prices of financial assets, which also widens the wealth gap because it helps those with the financial assets that are bid up relative to those who don't have financial assets. It also puts a lot of debt in the hands of the central bank, which allows the central bank to handle the debt however as they see fit. Also, their printing of the money and buying the financial assets, mostly bonds, holds interest rates down, which stimulates borrowing and buying and encourages those holding those bonds to sell them, and encourages the borrowing of money at low interest rates to invest it in higher returning assets, which leads central banks printing more money and buying more bonds and sometimes other financial assets. That typically does a good job of pushing up financial asset prices, but is relatively inefficient in getting money and credit and buying power into the hands of the people that need it most. That is what happened in 2008 and has happened for the most of the time until just recently. Then, when the printing of money and the central bank's buying up a financial asset fails to get money and credit where it needs to go, the central bank, which can decide what to spend money on, borrows money from the central bank, which prints it so it can spend it on what it needs to be spent on. In the US, the Fed announced this plan on April 9, 2020. This approach of printing money to buy debt, called debt monetization, is vastly more politically palatable way of as a way of getting money and shifting wealth from those who have it to those who need it, then imposing taxes, which leads tax people to get angry. That is why, in the end, central banks always print money and devalue. When governments print a lot of money and buy a lot of debt, so the amounts of both money and debt increase, they cheapen money and debt, which essentially taxes those who own it to make it easier for debtors and borrowers. When this happens enough that the holders of this money and debt assets realize what is happening, they seek to sell their debt assets and or borrow money to get into debt that they can pay back with cheap money. They also often move their wealth to other storeholds of wealth like gold, certain types of stocks, and or somewhere else like another country that is not having these problems. At such times, central banks have typically continued to print money and buy debt directly or indirectly, e.g. by having banks do the buying for them, and have outlawed the flow of money into inflation-hedged assets and alternative currencies in alternative places. Such periods of reflation either stimulate another money and credit expansion that finances another economic expansion, which is good for stocks, or devalue money so that it produces monetary inflation, which is good for inflation-hedged assets like gold. Earlier in the long-term debt cycle, when the amounts of debt of standing debts aren't large and when there is lots of room to stimulate by lowering interest rates and failing that, printing money and buying financial assets, the greater likelihood that credit growth and economic growth will be good, while in the later long-term cycle, when the debts are large and when there isn't much room to stimulate by lowering interest rates or printing money and buying financial assets, the greater likelihood that there will be monetary inflation accompanied by economic weakness. Then comes the flight back into hard money. When taken too far, the overprinting of fiat currency lends to the selling of debt assets in the earlier described bank run dynamic, which ultimately reduces the value of money and credit, which prompts people to flee out of both the currency and the debt, e.g. bonds. They need to decide what alternative storehold of wealth they will use. History teaches us that they typically turn to gold, other currencies, assets in other countries not having these problems, and stocks that retain their real value. Some people think that there needs to be an alternative reserve currency to go to, but that's not true, as the same dynamic of the breakdown of the monetary system and the running of to other assets happen in cases in which there was no alternative currency to go to, e.g. in China and in the Roman Empire. The debasement of the currency leads it to devalue and have people run from it and debt denominated in it into something else. There is a whole litany of things people run to when money is devalued, including rocks used for construction in Germany's Weimar Republic. Typically, at this stage in the debt cycle, there is also economic stress caused by large wealth and value gaps, which lead to higher taxes and fighting between the rich and poor, which also makes those with wealth want to move to hard assets in other currencies in other countries. Naturally, those who are governing the countries that are suffering from this flight from debt, their currency, and their country wanting to stop it. So at such times, governments make it hard to invest in assets like gold, e.g. via outlawing gold transactions and ownership, foreign currencies via eliminating the ability to transact in them, and foreign countries via establishing foreign exchange controls to prevent the money from leaving the country. Eventually, the debt is largely wiped out, usually by making the money to pay it back plentiful and cheap, which devalues both the money and the debt. Well, that sounds a lot like Bitcoin. When this becomes extreme so that the money and credit financial system breaks down and debts have been devalued or defaulted on, necessity generally compels governments to go back to some form of hard currency to rebuild people's faith in the value of money as a storehold of wealth so that credit growth can resume. Quite often, though, it's not always the government links its money to some hard money, e.g. gold or hard reserve currency, with promises to allow holders of the new money to make that conversion to hard money. Sometimes that hard money is in other countries. For example, over the past decades, many weak currency countries have linked their money to the US dollar or simply dollarized their economy, i.e. use the dollar as their own medium of exchange and storehold of wealth. To review, in the long-term debt cycle, holding debt as an asset that provides interest is typically rewarding early in the cycle when there isn't a lot of debt outstanding, but holding debt late in the cycle when there is a lot outstanding, it is closer to being defaulted on or devalued is risky relative to the interest rate being given. So holding debt, e.g. bonds, is a bit like holding a ticking time bomb that rewards you while it's still ticking and blows you up when it goes off. And as we've seen, that big blow up, i.e. big default or big devaluation, happens something like once every 50 to 75 years. These cycles of debt and writing off debts have existed for thousands of years and in some cases have been institutionalized. For example, the Old Testament provided for a year of Jubilee every 50 years in which debts were forgiven. Leviticus 28:25, 8-13. Knowing that the debt cycle would happen on that schedule allowed everyone to act in a rational way in preparation for it, helping you understand its dynamics so that you are prepared for it rather than are surprised by it is the main objective behind my writing this. Because most people don't pay attention to the cycle in relation to what they are experiencing, ironically, the closer people are to the blow up, the safer they tend to feel. That's because they have held the debt and enjoyed the rewards of doing that, and the longer it has been from the time since the last one blew up, the more comfortable they have become as the memories of the last blow up fade, even as the risk of holding this debt rise and the rewards of holding it decline. By keeping an eye on the amount of debt that needs to be paid relative to the amount of hard money that there is to pay it, the amounts of debt payments that had to be made relative to the amount of cash flow the debtors have to service the debt, and the interest rewards that one is getting for lending one's money, one can assess the risk-reward of holding the time bomb. The long-term debt cycle in summary. For thousands of years, there have always been three types of monetary system. Hard money, e.g. metal coins, paper money, claims on hard money, fiat money, e.g. the US dollar today. Hard money is the most restrictive system because money can't be created unless the supply of the metal or other intrinsically valuable commodity that is the money is increased. Money and credit are more easily created in the second type of system, so the ratio of the claims on the hard money to the actual hard money rises, which eventually leads to a run on the banks. The result is A. Defaults when the bank closes its door and the depositors lose their hard assets, and or B. Devaluations of the claims on money, which means that the depositors get back less. In the third type of system, governments can create money and credit freely, which works for as long as people continue to have confidence in the currency and fails when they don't. Throughout history, countries have transitioned across these different types of systems for logical reasons. As a country needs more money and credit than it currently has, whether to deal with debt, wars, or other problems, it naturally moves from type 1 to type 2 or type 2 to type 3, so that it has more flexibility to print money. Then creating too much money and debt depreciates its value, causing people to get out of holding the debt and money as a storehold of wealth, moving back into hard assets like gold and other currencies. Since this typically takes place when there is a wealth conflict and sometimes a war, there is typically also a desire to get out of the country. Such countries need to reestablish confidence in the currency as a storehold of wealth before they can restore their credit markets. The below diagram conveys these different transitions. There are many historical examples from the Song Dynasty to Weimar Germany of countries making the full transition from constrained types, type 1 and type 2, to fiat money, then back to constrained currency as the old fiat currency hyperinflates. As noted earlier, this big debt cycle plays out over the long term, something like 50 to 75 years, and at its end it is characterized by a restructuring of debts and of the monetary system. The abrupt parts of these restructurings, i.e. the debt and currency crisis periods, typically happening quickly, lasting only months to up to 3 years, depending on how long it takes the government to exercise these moves. However, the ripple effects of them can be long-lasting. For example, these currencies can lead to reserve currencies stopping being reserve currencies. With each of these currency regimes, there are typically 2 to 4 Within each of these currency regimes, there are typically 2 to 4 big debt crises, i.e., big enough to cause banking crises and debt write-downs or devaluations of 30% or more, but not big enough to break the currency system. Because I have invested in many countries for about 50 years, I have experienced dozens of them. They all run the same way, which I explained in greater depth in my book, Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. The monetary system that we are in from its beginning until now. The dollar became the world's leading reserve currency when the United States became the world's strongest economic and military power at the end of World War II. Since then, having the world's leading reserve currency has been critical to the United States sustaining and extending its power. That is because a great power comes from being able to create money and credit in the currency that is widely accepted around the world as a medium of exchange and storehold of wealth. As a result of having the ability to print the world's currency, the United States' relative financial economic power is multiple times the size of its real economic power. At the risk of boring you by repeating some of the things I've already told you, I will now reveal the U.S. case and the circumstances that led the U.S. and the dollar putting the world in the position that we are in now. In brief, the New World Order began after the end of World War II in 1945 with the Bretton Woods Agreement, having put the dollar in the position of being the world's leading reserve currency in 1944. The U.S. and the dollar naturally fit into that role because at the end of the war, the U.S. had around 2/5 of the world's gold held by governments, which was with world's money at the time, accounted for 50% of the world's economic production and was dominant military power. The new monetary system was a type 2, i.e. claims on hard money, monetary system in which paper dollar claims on gold could be exchanged by other countries' central banks for an ounce of gold at the price of $35 an ounce. It was then illegal for individuals to own gold because government leaders didn't want gold to compete with money and credit as a storehold of wealth. So at the time, gold was the money in the bank and the paper dollars were like checks in a checkbook that could be turned in for the real money. At the time of the establishment of this new monetary system, there was $50 of paper money in existence for each ounce of gold the U.S. government owned. So there's nearly 100% gold backing. Other major countries that were U.S. allies or under U.S. control had U.S. controlled currencies that were linked to the dollar. In the years that followed to finance its activities, the U.S. government spent more than it took in tax revenue, so it had to borrow money, which created more dollar-denominated debt. The U.S. Federal Reserve allowed the creation of a lot more claims on gold than it could actually be converted to gold at that $35 price. As the paper money was turned in for hard money, gold, the quantity of gold in the U.S. bank went down. At the same time, the claims on it continued to rise. As a result, President Nixon, like Roosevelt, defaulted on the U.S.'s promise to allow holders of paper dollars to turn them into gold. Thus, the dollar devalued against gold and other currencies. That is when the U.S. and other countries went to a Type 3 fiat monetary system. If you want to read a great description of this process of figuring out how to go from old monetary system to the new fiat one, I recommend Changing Fortunes by Paul Volcker, who was the leading American negotiator of how the new monetary system would work. I think that guy died recently. Or maybe not. This move to a fiat monetary system freed the Federal Reserve and the other central banks to create a lot of dollar-denominated money and credit, which led to the inflationary 1970s, which is characterized by a flight from dollars and dollar-denominated debt to goods, services, and inflation hedge assets such as gold. That panic out of the dollar debt also led to interest rates to rise and drove the price of gold from the $35 I was fixed at to then the peak of $670. With the money and credit managed this way in the 1970s, it was profitable to borrow dollars and convert them into goods and services. So many entities in many countries borrowed dollars largely through U.S. banks to do that. As a result, dollar-denominated debt grew rapidly around the world. As U.S. banks made a lot of money lending it to these borrowers, this lending led it to the classic debt bubble part of the debt cycle. The panic out of dollars and dollar debt assets and into inflation hedge assets, as well as the rapid borrowing of dollars and the getting into debt accelerated. That created the money and credit crisis of 1979 to 82, which during the time the US dollar and dollar-denominated debt were at risk of ceasing to be an accepted storehold of wealth. Of course, the average citizen didn't understand how this money and credit dynamic worked, but they felt it in the form of high inflation and high interest rates, so it was a huge political issue. President Carter, who like most political leaders didn't understand the monetary mechanics very well, knew that something had to be done to stop it and appointed a stronger monetary policy maker, Paul Volcker. Just about everyone who followed such things, including me, hung on his every word. He was strong enough to do the painful but right things needed to break the back of inflation. He became a hero of mine and eventually a good personal friend because of his great character and capabilities. I loved his wry humor too. To deal with that monetary inflation crisis and to break the back of inflation, Volcker tightened the supply of money, which drove interest rates to the highest level since Jesus Christ, according to German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. Because the interest rate was far above the inflation rate, debtors had to pay much more in debt service at the same time as their incomes and assets fell in value. That squeezed the debtors and required them to sell assets. Because of the great need for dollars, the US dollar was strong. For these reasons, inflation rates fell, which allowed the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates and ease money and credit for Americans. Of course, many of the debtors and the holders of these assets were falling in value went broke. So in the 1980s, these debtors, especially foreign debtors, and more specifically those in emerging countries, went through a decade-long depression and debt restructuring period. The Federal Reserve protected the American banks by providing them with the money they needed, and the American accounting system protected them from going broke by not requiring them to account for these bad debts as losses or value these debts assets at realistic prices. This debt management and restructuring process lasted until 1991, when it was completed through the Brady Bond Agreement, named after Nicholas Brady, who was the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury at the time. This whole 1971 to 91 cycle, which affected just about everyone in the world, was the result of the U.S. going off the gold standard. It led to the soaring inflation and inflation hedge assets of the 1970s, which led to the 1979 to 81 tightening, and a lot of deflationary debt restructuring by non-American debtors. Falling inflation rates and excellent performance of bonds and other deflationary assets in the 1980s. The entire period was a forceful demonstration of the power of the U.S. Having the world's reserve currency and the implications for everyone around the world of how that currency was managed. From that 1979 to 81 peak in dollar-denominated inflation and dollar-denominated interest rates until now, both the inflation rates and interest rates have fallen to nearly 0%. You can clearly see that the whole big cycle up and down in interest rates and inflation rates since the dollar-denominated monetary system. After the 1980s debt restructurings were completed, the 1990s saw a new global increase in money, credit, and debt begin again, which again produced prosperity that led to debt-financed purchases of speculative investments that became the dot-com bubble, which burst in 2000. That led to an economic downturn in 2000 to 2001 that spurred the Federal Reserve to ease money and credit, which pushed debt levels to new highs and created another prosperity that turned into another and bigger debt bubble in 2007, which burst in 2008, which led the Fed and other reserve currency countries' central banks to ease again, leading to the next bubble that just recently burst. So between the 1980s, debt restructuring, and 2008, there were two fairly typical debt/economic cycles. However, the credit/economic contraction of 2008 needed to be handled differently. Because short-term interest rates hit zero in 2008, and the amount of interest rate decline wasn't enough to create the money and credit expansion that was needed, central banks needed to print more money and buy financial assets. Stimulating money and credit growth by lowering interest rates is the first choice of monetary policy of central banks. I call it monetary policy 1. With this approach no longer available to central banks, they turn to the second choice monetary policy, which I call monetary policy number 2, which is the printing of money and the buying of financial assets, mostly government bonds and some high quality debt. The last time they needed to do that, because interest rates hit zero, began in 1933 and continued even through the war years. This approach is called quantitative easing rather than debt monetization because it sounds less threatening. All the world's major reserve currency central banks did this. This paradigm that began in 2008 worked as follows. By printing money and buying debt, as it had done beginning in 1933, central banks kept the money and debt expansion cycle going. They did that by making these purchases, which pushed bond prices up, providing the sellers of these bonds with cash, which led them to buy other assets. This pushed up those asset prices, and as they rose in price, drove future expected returns down. With interest rates below the expected returns of other investments and bond yields and other future returns falling to very low levels relative to the returns needed by investors to fund their various spending obligations, investors increasingly borrowed money to buy assets that they expected to have greater returns than their borrowing cost. In other words, they followed the classic bubble process of buying financial assets with borrowed money, betting that the assets they bought would have higher returns than the cost of their funds. Those leveraged purchases pushed these asset prices up, drove their expected future returns down, and created a new debt bubble vulnerability that would come home to roost if the incomes produced by the assets they bought had returns that were less than their borrowing cost. With both long-term and short-term interest rates around zero and central banks' purchases of bonds not as effectively flowing through to stimulate economic growth and to help those who needed it most, it became apparent to me that the second type of monetary policy wouldn't work well, and the third type of monetary policy, MP3, would be needed. MP3 works by the reserve currency central governments increasing their borrowing and targeting their spending and lending it to where they want it to go, with the reserve currency central banks creating money and credit and buying debt and possibly other assets like stocks to fund these purchases. Throughout all this time, inclusive of all these swings, the amount of dollar-denominated money, credit, and debt in the world and the amounts of other non-debt liabilities such as pensions and healthcare continue to rise in relation to incomes, especially in the U.S. because of the Federal Reserve's unique ability to support this debt growth. Though I won't explain the various ways of doing that here, they were explained in my book, Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises, which you can get online for free here. So before we had the pandemic-induced turndown, the circumstances were set up for this path being the necessary one in the event of a downturn. If you want to look at relevant research pieces that look into these issues at greater depth than I did at the time, you can find them at economicprinciples.org. In any case, throughout this period, debt and non-debt obligations, e.g. pensions and healthcare, continue to rise relative to the incomes while central banks manage to keep debt service costs down. See my report, The Big Picture, for a far more complete explanation of the coming squeeze this will cause. This pushed interest rates down toward nil and made the debt long-term so that the principal payments would be low. These conditions, i.e. central banks owning a lot more debt, interest rates around zero so no interest payment would be required, and structuring debt to be paid back over the long term so principal payments could be spread out or even possibly not paid back, meant that there was little or no limit to the capacities of central banks to create money and credit. That set of conditions set the stage for what came next. The coronavirus triggered economic and market downturns around the world, which created holes in incomes and balance sheets, especially for indebted entities that had incomes that suffered from the downturn. Classically, central governments and central banks had to create money and credit to get it to those entities they wanted to save that financially wouldn't have survived without that money and credit. So on April 9th, 2020, the U.S. Central Bank, the Fed, announced a massive monetary and credit creation program alongside massive programs from the U.S. central government, the President, and Congress. They all included the classic MP3 techniques, including helicopter money, direct payments from the government to citizens. It was essentially the same announcement that Roosevelt made on March 5th, 1933. While the virus triggered this particular financial and economic downturn, something else would have eventually triggered it. And regardless of what did, the dynamic would have been basically the same because only MP3 would have reversed the turndown. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and to a lesser extent the People's Bank of China made similar moves. Though what matters most is what the Federal Reserve did because it is a creator of dollars, which are still the world's dominant credit and money. The US dollar now accounts for about 55% of the world's international transactions, savings, and borrowing. The Eurozone euro accounts for about 25%. The Japanese yen accounts for less than 10%. The Chinese ruble accounts for about 2%. Most other currencies are not used internationally as mediums of exchange or storeholds of wealth, though they are used within countries. Those other currencies are the ones that even the smart people in those countries and eventually everyone outside those countries won't hold as storeholds as wealth. In contrast, the reserve currencies I mentioned are the currencies that most people around the world like to save, borrow, and transact in, roughly in proportion to the percentages I just mentioned. Countries that have the world's reserve currency have amazing power. Reserve currency is probably the most important power to have, even more than military power. That is because when a country has a reserve currency, it can print money and borrow money to spend as it sees fits. The way the U.S. is doing it now. While those that don't have a reserve currency have to get money and credit that they need, which is denominated in the world's reserve currency, to transact and save in it. For example, right now, as of this writing, those who have a lot of debt they need to service and need more dollars to buy goods and services now that their dollar incomes have fallen are strongly demanding dollars. As shown in the chart in Chapter 1 that depicts 8 measures of a country's rising and declining power, the reserve currency power, which is measured by the share of transactions and savings in that currency, significantly lags the other measures of the country's strength. That has been true for the U.S. and the U.S. dollar. For example, in 1944, when the U.S. dollar was anointed as the world's dominant reserve currency, the U.S. had around 2/3 of the world's gold held by governments, which was considered money at the time and accounted for half the world GDP. Today, the U.S. accounts for around 20% of world GDP, but still accounts for about 60% of global reserves and about half of international transactions. So the U.S. dollar and dollar-based monetary and payment systems still reign supreme and are sized relative to the rest of the U.S. economy. As with all banks that printed reserve currencies, the Federal Reserve is now in a strong but awkward position of running its monetary policy in a way that is good for Americans, but that might not be good for others around the world who are dependent on dollars. For example, the U.S. central government just recently decided that I would need to borrow money and give it in dollar credit to Americans, and the Federal Reserve decided to buy that U.S. government debt and a lot more other debt to help Americans through this financial crisis. Understandably, little of that will go to foreigners. The European Central Bank will do something similar for those in the Eurozone. The Bank of Japan, which is still smaller on the world scene, will do something for the Japanese, and the People's Bank of China will do the same for the Chinese. A couple of relatively other small countries like Switzerland might be able to do something similar for those people, but most of the world won't get the money and credit they need to fill their income and balance sheet holes the way the Americans will. This dynamic of countries not being able to get the hard currency they need is like what happened in 1982 to 91 period, except interest rates can't be cut significantly this time, while they could be cut significantly in that 1982 to 91 period. At the same time, dollar-denominated debt owned by non-Americans, i.e. those in emerging markets, European countries, and China, is about $20 trillion, which is about 50% higher than what it was in 2008, with a bit less than half of that total being short-term. These dollar debtors will have to come up with a way with dollars to service those debts, and they will have to come up with more dollars to buy goods and services in world markets. So by having the US dollar as a reserve currency and having the world's bank that produces the currency, And having the power to put those dollars in the hands of Americans, the U.S. can help Americans more effectively than other country governments can help their own citizens. At the same time, the U.S. risks losing this privileged position by creating too much money in debt. In the appendix in this chapter, we will look much closely at how countries that had reserve currencies lost them and how devaluations of currencies work. In summary, how the big cycle of money, credit, and debt and economic activity fits in with the big domestic and international political cycles to affect the world order. Stepping back to look at all this from a big picture level, what I'm saying about the relationship between 1, the economic part, i.e. money, credit, debt, economic activity, and wealth, and 2, the political part, both within countries and between countries of rises and declines look like the picture shown below. Typically, the big cycles start with New World Order, i.e. a new way of operating both domestically and internationally that includes a new monetary system and new political systems. The last one began in 1945. Because of such times, after the conflicts, there are dominant powers that no one wants to fight, and people are tired of fighting. There's peaceful rebuilding and increasing prosperity that is supported by credit expansion that is sustainable. It is sustainable because income growth exceeds or keeps pace with the debt service payments that are required to service the growing debt, and because central bank capacities to stimulate credit and economic growth is great. Along the way, there are short-term debt and economic cycles that we call recessions and expansions. With time, investors extrapolate past gains into the future and borrow money to bet on them continuing to happen, which creates debt bubbles at the same time as the wealth gap grows because some benefit more than others from this money making upswing. This continues until central banks run out of their ability to stimulate credit and economic growth effectively. As money becomes tighter, the debt bubble bursts and credit contracts with it, and with it the economy contracts. At the same time, when there is a large wealth gap, big debt problems, and an economic contraction, there's often fighting within countries and between countries over wealth and power. These typically lead to revolutions and wars that can either be violent or peaceful. At such times of debt and economic problems, central governments and central banks typically create money and credit to fund their domestic and war-related financial needs. These money and credit crisis revolutions of war lead to restructurings of A, the debt, B, the monetary system, C, the world order, and D, the international order, which together I'm simply calling the world order. Then it starts again. For example, in the United States in the 1930 to 45 period, there's a peaceful domestic revolution that produced a significant wealth redistribution that was accompanied by large government borrowing, creating a lot of government debt that was financed by the central bank, creating a lot of money and credit. This was followed by violent external wars that were due to rising powers challenging existing world powers, with these wars financed by large government borrowings that created a lot of debt that was financed by central banks, creating a lot of money and credit. The cycle that I'm describing is conveyed in the chart below. While no cycle goes exactly the same way, almost all of them, by and large, go that way. The explanation of money and credit will be followed by an appendix that will show why and how all currencies devalue and or die, with references to the most important cases of the last 500 years. Alrighty.